When we start thinking about all the things that could go wrong in our classrooms, it's enough to make our heads explode. But in reality, it's actually a pretty short list of things that we need to set up some structures around to make sure that things go smoothly. Stick around to get yourself set up for success. Welcome back, team. This is Dr. Sitchy Parker, and I am so glad you're back for another training session with your teaching coach. As always, it's my goal with these videos to help you develop your competence in all things teaching, to help you find and strengthen your voice of advocacy for yourself and your students, and to help you create justice by dismantling the systems of oppression that are all around you. In last week's video, I talked to you about how classroom behavior has really been taking a toll on school systems since students returned after COVID has started to release its grip on all of us. You can check out that video right here if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet. The give and take between students and teachers seems to be off, and the whole social contract of what school is and how it's supposed to work seems to have disappeared for some. Personally, I don't believe that things have changed so much that what we know about human psychology no longer works. In fact, I think that what we do know will definitely work as long as we pay attention to the science of the matters at hand. Teaching the way our favorite teachers taught us is not going to get us through this crisis. We all became teachers. We all loved school to some extent or another. And if we didn't love school, we all saw the value in it at least. We all had the internal motivation to do well. So we're going to save the psychology of motivation for another video, but let me just wrap up this context section by reminding you of the 5 requirements for tight classroom management, and then we'll dig into the first requirement, maximizing structure, which is the topic of this video. So the 5 requirements. Number 1, maximize structure. Explicitly define routines, arrange physical space to avoid crowding and distractions. Number 2, establish and teach rules. Post, teach, review, monitor, and reinforce them. Number 3, actively engage students during instruction. For example, employ peer tutoring, use direct instruction. Number 4, use a variety of strategies to respond to appropriate behaviors, such as praise or token economies. And number 5, use a variety of strategies to respond to inappropriate behaviors, such as planned ignoring or specific feedback. So now that we've refreshed or reviewed a little bit what we talked about in our last video, let's dig right into maximizing structure. First of all, structure and control are not synonyms. Nothing that I'm about to tell you should be mistaken for ways to force children to do your bidding. I am a firm believer in self-determination for all people, including children, and any power we have must come from the consent of the governed. In other words, I'm not here to make anybody do things that they are uncomfortable doing. I am going to push them to become powerful and to move forward and do all the good things for themselves, but I have to teach them how to do those things. That being said, however, we have a job to do, a very important job that holds the fate of society in our hands, literally. So we must listen to our students when they object or refuse to participate because they're communicating with us. Their objections are a reminder to us that something still needs attending to that we haven't seen yet. Something that is a roadblock to our students and their learning. We need to engage them and their grown-ups in conversation until we can figure out what that is. So blindly forcing kids to do what we want them to do is not maximizing structure. That is not what I'm trying to teach you in today's video. We're going to talk about 2 aspects of structure. First, let's talk about the physical space. Number 1, make sure that you can see every nook and cranny from any place that you might be in the room. Any areas that you cannot see are areas that can become trouble spots. If you have a reading nook in your classroom, angle it so that you can see into it from wherever you would normally be circulating in your classroom. Don't block your view of the space by enclosing it with a bookshelf. This bird's eye view of the room allows you to surveil all of the happenings from wherever you are, and you'll never be caught unaware of anything that's happening. From a justice perspective, I think this is particularly important because those secluded spots are prime locations for bullying or assaults to occur. Even if you think that that couldn't happen in your classroom, if there are places that you cannot see what's happening, it could happen. Even if you can't hear what's being said, you'll definitely recognize the pleading eyes of a kid who feels in danger, and then you'll be there to protect them. But when they're hidden by a wall of lockers or storage tubs or bookshelves, you won't see them, and the consequences of that could be lifelong for those children. Number 2, think about the traffic patterns that might exist before you commit to any particular floor plans or routines. Whether you teach in a grade where lining up is practiced, or where there are many trips to the pencil sharpener or to the Chromebook cart, notice where students are going to be moving. Will they be walking past students who'll be working? Will there be traffic along storage shelves or lots of hubbub where student work is being collected? Will lines cut across storage areas for materials? Or will students be seated next to your beautiful bulletin boards with time on their hands and pencils in their hands too? Finally, number 3, have a place for everything and keep everything in its place. Keep teacher-only items together and clearly labeled, preferably behind your desk or in a cabinet or closet. At the same time, you might want to keep some teaching items near where you'll need them to save prep time, but only put out as much of any item as will be used right away or that you can afford to lose. Never, ever, under any circumstances, put out your year's supply of whiteboard markers just so you'll always have one handy, because after a few weeks you won't have any left. Avoid clutter because it detracts from the learning environment. Do what you want on your own desk, but cluttered shelves can cause anxiety for some children, and really busy with lots of decorations and things hanging from the ceiling can cause sensory overload for children who are neurodiverse, like those with autism or ADHD. Also, in many places, things hanging from the ceiling are outlawed as a fire hazard anyway. If you have a place for everything and everything is in its place, you can do a quick scan around the room several times a day and make sure that nothing is missing or broken and that the students will be safe and that you'll have the materials you need to teach. The other type of structure that we're going to talk about are routines. Routines are structures that you determine before students are present, and then you teach and reinforce them once the students are in the space. No matter where you teach, taking attendance is always a hassle. We want to get in there and get started, but we always have to do the paperwork. Here's an example of a routine to teach students in elementary school to help you take care of attendance. As the students come into the room, they move the clothespin with their name on it to the Here strip, and only those students who are absent are left behind. When I taught middle school, I combined my task of attendance with the students doing a task called a warm-up. I always had a problem on the board that was either a review of the work from the day before, a basic skills review, or a challenge of what was to come today for them to attempt while I handled attendance. One piece of advice for this is always to make this task meaningful and to always go over the warm-up with the students before you jump into the rest of the class. I've seen student teachers use this warm-up technique, but they toss out the warm-up and they never go over it, and that destroys the student's incentive because the work they did was never corrected or reviewed by the teacher, and they don't want to do it. They stop paying attention to it. Getting the attention of the class used to be more difficult than it has been in recent years. I've been around long enough that we didn't used to have a universal signal, and teachers used to do all kinds of stuff to get students' attention. Nowadays, it's pretty common for a teacher just to raise their hand, and kids who see the teacher are asked to raise their hand and stop what they're doing and give their attention to the teacher, and then it passes throughout the whole class. We didn't have that when I started. Yay for evidence-based practices. So if you're not using that signal, you might want to teach it and then add it into your own work. It really works. The way that you give instructions is going to depend a lot on the abilities of your students to follow multi-step instructions. In earlier grades or in certain types of classrooms, you're going to have to give one instruction at a time. In later grades, you might have instructions for a long unit typed or even on a web page that will cover an entire quarter. Regardless, you will structure how you give instructions to meet the needs of your students, and then you have to teach them to receive the instructions in that way. Whatever your style is, that's how you teach them, and that's how you'll then give instructions from that point forward. When it comes time to distribute materials, you should have a plan that is relatively consistent based on whatever you're handing out. You don't want to waste time each time you have to hand out something when the students try to figure out what's happening. Maybe with art supplies, you'll assign one student per group to come up and retrieve the supply. Maybe with papers, you'll count out how many papers are needed for the number of students in each row. Don't be the teacher that hands the entire stack of papers to the closest student and they have to figure out what to do with the stack. I've seen it, just don't do it. This next one is a controversial one. What are you going to do with students who don't have their learning materials? I don't have a pencil. I didn't bring my book. Do you have a piece of paper I could use today? Instead of having a mini breakdown every time that happens, because you know it's going to happen, let's just make a plan. Are you going to be the teacher that has a backup for the student who doesn't have what they need? Or are you going to be the teacher that makes a big deal about it and cuts into their learning time and maybe humiliates them just a little bit? What is your end goal? My choice was always to be the teacher who had extra pencils, who had free notebooks. I think you can get them for 19 cents at Target in the back to school aisle. And I always had a classroom copy of the textbook. Was my kindness always rewarded? Did the students suddenly become amazing at keeping track of their materials? No, they didn't. But did I believe that the students were targeting me by forgetting classroom materials? No, they weren't. The students who were chronically not having what they needed were also the ones who were dealing with adverse childhood traumas or hunger or whose parents were working 2 jobs. So my investment in an extra box of pencils, which truthfully I probably just got from the supply room, was not a big deal. And it made their lives a little easier, and it got us back to learning, got us back on track. A few other places where you can inject some structure would be at transitions between activities. You should teach students how you want them to end one activity and start on the next. For example, when you finish a test, students should know that they should have some reading material so that they could just open a book and sit quietly while they wait for everyone to finish up. Bathroom passes and water bottles or passes to get a drink are constant sources of interruption, especially if you don't have some routines built in around those activities. And while making students carry a toilet seat for a bathroom pass can seem hilarious, it's not particularly classy. At the very minimum, you should have a condition built into your routine that students can't interrupt your teaching to ask for bathroom passes. It's bothersome to everyone's learning. Unplanned interruptions are also a source of annoyance when you're teaching, so you should teach students what you'd like them to do when they arise. Fire and tornado drills and, of course, sadly, lockdown drills need to be practiced, but they should have clear expectations taught around what you want from the students before, during, and after. Expect students to want to do what's good and right. Teach them what that is, and thank them for it, and reinforce it strongly if you need to with those that are more reluctant to participate. Finally, students of all ages love getting a job that is a break from the ordinary. We often think about this only for elementary students, but I think students of all ages like a little recognition and a break once in a while. Need something taken to the office? You need a messenger. Can't get the projector to work? Where's the tech expert? Do you need to talk to a student in the hall at the beginning of class? I'm sure you've got someone that would love to take attendance for you. I've seen many teachers in my 30 years in public education who think that adding too much structure into their classroom is somehow being mean to their students and taking away their freedom. I believe it is exactly the opposite. I believe that not having enough structure in your classroom is walking away from your responsibilities as a teacher. Not every student is going to need you to run a tight ship, but the most vulnerable students in your classroom will certainly need you to do that. Students who require specially designed instruction, in other words, those in special ed, will not fare well if you're the type of teacher who employs a sink or swim style of teaching. Students who are learning English aren't going to do well if you aren't structured in how you accommodate their learning needs and how you set up your classroom. LGBTQ+ students aren't going to do well if you're not vigilant to protect them from bullying and harassment. None of these students with differences are going to do well if you don't plan for their inclusion and teach students how to work together. If you have any lingering questions or thoughts about maximizing structure in your classroom, please drop me a note in the comments. I'm really interested to hear whether you agree with my thoughts about a teacher's responsibility to provide a structured environment in their classroom. Besides, it will really help out my channel if you'd leave a comment about something you saw that connected with you. If you like this content, please hit the like button and make sure you've subscribed. If you didn't like this video, leave me a comment and tell me why not. Whether you liked it or not, please consider sharing it with just 2 people who you think might have an interest in this content. The topic of next week's video will be how to establish and teach your classroom rules. As mundane as it might seem, this topic is actually one of my favorite things to teach my graduate students because it is so powerful. I can't wait to share these tips and tricks with you. Until next time, stay strong, stay healthy, and get some rest.